Stop sharing my screen. All right, you're all good.
Thanks very much. Welcome, everybody. Glad to see all the friendly faces on the attendee list today. Many of you I haven't talked to in a little while, but I'm sure glad to see you on the session today. Wanted to speak a little bit about Learn With Us, which is what we're on today. Learn With Us was a session type that Western IM devised about 18 months ago. We wanted to try and get some learning going on for all of the folks in our community. Because nothing was going on, we weren't able to meet together during COVID. So we put that on, and it's been very successful and great, and we've really enjoyed doing that series of events. The other one that's coming up next week is called I Am Canada Connect, and that's a new series type of learning available, Canadian content learning, put on by the ARMA chapters across Canada. Essentially what happens there is each chapter puts up one presentation, and that way we get an entire year of Canadian content education for all of the ARMA folks across the country, or our community across the country. So that one's coming up next week, and next week, just as for instance, next week is the ARMA Saskatchewan chapter doing this month's presentation, and you'll see that in a bunch of social media. Ping us if you need more information on either of those sets of things. Today, we're doing a session on policy, and actually, two of my friends, people I consider my friends, on this discussion today is a great thing to have. Ken Oldenburger from Victoria and Louis Eisen from Ottawa. Louis, of course, speak to Louis first. He's of course I call Louis the policy whisperer. So he's the guy that's always around during the policy situations all over North America right now. I see Louis's name related to that everywhere. He's also a best-selling author, and I did read your book, Louis. So I have it and refer to it on a regular basis. Ken Oldenburger. Ken's one of the top consultants in the country on records and information management, and most of you know Ken. He was on the ARMA region team and has been around for more than a year or two. Ken, glad to be able to do projects with Ken on occasion as well, and understand his capabilities. So today we have Ken did a recording up first, and we'll be playing that recording first. It's a traditional look at policy development, Ken, that recording you did for us, and I think we'll play that one first, and then we'll come back, and Louis will speak a little bit about policy after that. I also wanted to introduce Troy Sawyer, who you can see on here, and most of you know Troy if you've been on any of our Learn With Us or I Am Canada Connect sessions. Western IM does kind of front all of these things in our webinar system for ARMA and for the Learn With Us sessions. So Troy is my partner and the Director of Development, Software Development at Western IM. So I am Rick Sterling, for any of you that don't know me, and I'm the President of Western IM. So Troy, if you could fire up Ken's presentation.
Sure. Yeah, I'll bring this up. And while we're showing the video here, we'll also mute our mics, and we'll come back afterwards. Oh,
I should say to all of you as well that the chat is a good place to put your questions and information. You could also put it in QA if you chose to do that. They're both open for you to use. We'll be monitoring both during the session, so just feel free to fire questions in if you want us to discuss them later.
Okay. Sounds good.
Welcome to Records and Information Management Policies. Welcome to Records and Information Management Policies. At the high level, I should mention, we're not going to be talking about details or content in this presentation. That's for some other discussions. My name is Ken Oldenburger. I've been doing records classification consulting for about 28 years, and I've been doing policy development for about 14, 15 years of that. So let's answer Let's talk about the first question. Do we need RIM policies? Especially if you're a small organization, do you really need them? It's pretty obvious that larger organizations do need them in order to keep control of their records management programs. Smaller organizations, you also need them. And there's a couple reasons why. First reason is, obviously, you need guidelines. You do need some instructions. And when I say guidelines, I mean policies, procedures, standards, instructions, forms, these things that give you guidelines around how to do things with regard to records management inside your organization. Guidelines are very, very important. One that we often don't think about, though, is accountability. Accountability in a records management program is a very important thing as well. As a matter of fact, you may have recognized accountability as being one of the 8 generally accepted record-keeping principles. And I personally think that it is probably the most important principle out of the 8. So when we talk about accountability, I kind of like the metaphor of a ladder. And the fact is that authority and responsibility comes from your highest decision-making body. Often I'm dealing with a board or a council, and so they're the ones who approve a lot of decisions that go on in the organization. So authority and responsibility comes from them. And records management authority and responsibility touches literally on every position in an organization that deals with records and information, all the way down to your knowledge or information workers. So that's not a difficult thing to imagine. It may be surprising to you that the board is actually responsible for records management, and so are every information worker. They have responsibility and authority to do things in a records management environment. The flip side of all of this, of course, is that there's compliance and reporting that goes back up the ladder. So information workers, knowledge workers, they give information, they're compliant to policies, and that goes back up the chain to the board. So there's this give and take up and down the ladder, which describes accountability. And it helps to think of the policies and procedures as rungs in that ladder. So the accountability, the authority, responsibility, compliance, reporting, they follow those rungs of policy. All right, let's get right into what we're talking about at a high level when we want to look at RIM policies. So the first option is number 1. And this was very popular in the mid-90s, especially in BC municipalities, that you would have a giant, all-in, board-approved policy. And it would look something like this. Just a big, huge collection of procedures and policy statements and standards, all put into one huge document. We're talking 50 to 60 pages, not including attachments, because quite often people would do things like attach their classification system to this thing on top of all of it. This is not a good approach. I never recommend doing it this way for a couple of reasons. First of all, trying to find something in there is difficult. It is not a very readable document. If you want to find one paragraph talking about mobile use, mobile device data, do you know where you're going to find it? The next thing is, who's going to sit down and want to read a novella that is not all that exciting? It's policy language, so not the greatest bedtime reading. The second thing is, if you need to make an amendment to this document, you have to go to the board, which is the first challenge. The fact that you've got a 50 to 60 page document going in front of the board means that you might even hesitate to do an amendment, which is not good. You do want to keep your policies up to date. The next thing is, once it goes to the board, you might have a keener that starts reading through the entire thing and starts asking questions like, why are we doing it this way? And what does this mean? And how come this? Which may be going far beyond the auspices of your current amendment. So there's just a lot of negatives to having a giant all-in RIM policy. A far better option that I have found is, when you get to some organizations, having multiple reasonably sized policies. Yes, they might still have to go to the board for approval, but at least they're a bit more bite-sized. Probably the largest one would be what I call the foundational or the framework policy, usually the first policy that kind of explains what we're talking about with records and information management, or information governance if you're going all that direction. It introduces things like the principles, and it also has a glossary. And the glossary can be quite extensive because we do still use quite a bit of jargon and codes in our industry. So these need to be explained as they relate to other policies and documents. So the foundational or framework policy can get somewhat large, like 8 pages, maybe 9, and also include related documentation like legislation, standards, that sort of thing. All right. The other following policies are generally much shorter, and some can be just a couple of pages. So I say 5 to 15 policies. I usually have 5 basic policies that I recommend. But if you have a very eager and forward-thinking board or RIM program, you might get up to 15 policies. As long as they're focused and bite-sized, that's fine. It is still a challenge, though, that these are board approved. So when you do an amendment, you do still need to go to the board to get that amendment approved. Fortunately, like I said, these are more bite-sized. It helps your board to focus, keep them on track. I generally recommend this kind of approach for medium to large entities. By medium, I mean kind of about 8 departments or larger, maybe 500 information workers or larger, somewhere around there. The reason why I don't mind this happening for these types of organizations is because the board is generally familiar with the concepts of policies and approving them and amending them, and they don't go down rabbit holes and get distracted and things like that. So it's not a bad approach for these kinds of organizations. Smaller ones, it gets much more difficult, though. And that's why when we start getting into smaller ones, I tend to recommend options either 3A or 3B. So 3A is where we have the board or council approving one small, simple RIM policy. So it's a board or council RIM policy. And that essentially assigns authority for the entire RIM program to a position, hopefully to a RIM manager. If you don't have a RIM manager, then it may be the CAO, it may be the CEO, something like that. But it assigns responsibility. So basically it says, we establish a program. You might say what the program includes, what kind of documents, like a classification system, policies and procedures, training, this sort of stuff. And then saying, this position is responsible for maintaining that program. Okay? So it authorizes. Remember that ladder? That's why I got the ladder here. That's the first rung in that ladder going down. Then you have a RIM manager And that RIM manager develops and approves and amends the corporate RIM policies. So the top one is just a board RIM policy. The ones that the RIM manager does, those are corporate RIM policies. And so because you have one individual in charge of those overarching policies, it's much, much easier to keep your RIM program on track and to update these policies and procedures as time goes on. And then, of course, those corporate RIM policies give authority and responsibility to the departments, to other RIM staff, to the knowledge workers, that sort of thing. You might even see another level below this where the departments have some procedures. So document-specific procedures that they have created in order to manage a specific workflow around a document. All right. I like this approach, but there's actually another approach that may be even better. It's exactly the same. We start out the same, where the board or the council or whoever does a board RIM policy, short and simple, which assigns responsibility and authority to a RIM manager or whichever position. And then that RIM manager is in charge of the RIM program, a large portion of which is the RIM manual. So the RIM manual is an excellent concept that's reinforced by the Canadian standard, CGSB 72.34. And in this case, the policies, the procedures, even the glossary, the framework concepts can be embedded within a corporate RIM manual. This is a living, growing document. So one of the attachments would be your classification system. One of the attachments would be the original board level RIM policy. And it would lay out what are knowledge workers responsible to do, what are RIM staff responsible to do, what are departments responsible to do. And again, departments can add in their own workflows as a portion, an article, or a page in this RIM manual. I find this corporate RIM manual concept to be very, very flexible. And for that reason, I find it very, very helpful for smaller organizations. And smaller organizations, I tend to define between 0 and 100 information workers. All right. That is kind of the high level concepts that I wanted to introduce.
Just wanted to say, Lewis, that you're on.
Perfect.
So,
Thank you. So I'll tell you, I arrive at the same conclusion Ken does. That is, number 3B is the place to be. I get there from a slightly different approach, but I like the 3B approach so much that I recommend it even for large organizations, because I think that's the way to go. And there are a couple concepts that I'd like to throw at you in terms of policy design, which I want are helpful to think about as you put these pieces together. So I'm going to defer as subject matter expert of what's the right thing in a record situation. I defer to a records expert, a records policy expert like Ken. So I'm just really talking at the 10,000 foot level. And the first is that there is a very major distinction between a policy and a manual functionally. All right. You all have filled out an income tax form. Nod if you filled out an income tax form. See, everybody's nodding now. Okay. If you filled out an income tax form, before you filled it out, did you read the Income Tax Act? See, that's the policy. That's the document that contains all the official rules around the tax. But I'll bet very few of you, if any of you, read the Income Tax Act. What you read was a little booklet that said how to fill out your tax form. That's the manual. That tells you what you need to know to do your job. People will read the manual that tells them what they need to know to do their job. And one of the reasons that many people don't read policies is because 80% of what's in there is not information they need to know to do their job. And that's why they don't read it. So let's take all the information people actually need to know to do their job and move it into the manual. And the only thing that needs to come at the policy level are the things that need to be approved at that level. So, for instance, the definition of what constitutes private information in most jurisdictions is statutory. Well, your board doesn't have to approve that. That's decided. So you could put that in your manual already without having to make it a board decision that it's still true. There's all kinds of stuff that you can put in your manual without having to run it through the board. So the test for inclusion in a manual is, do I want people to know this? And the test for inclusion in the policy is, does my board have to make this decision in order for it to be true? And I agree with Ken, by the way, that absolutely you want one statement in there which delegates making most of the standards and the procedures down to the RIM level, if not even the ability to make some other policies, and to put other things in the manual so that the people at the top are not spending their time in the weeds. And I think one of the value that we're supposed to bring them is to separate the weeds from the really important stuff and make sure that they don't get lost in the weeds the way Ken was describing. You know, we're looking at your thing. Do we really need to do it that way? A second concept I want you to consider is the difference between approach of a policy and a standard, and why I believe standards are more useful for subject matter experts like records manager. Imagine you wanted your kid to clean the room. And well, we've all been there, okay? You know, you give them all kinds of instructions, but you say, here's what I want you to do. I want you to make the bed, get the stuff off the floor, put the books back on the shelf, close in the closet, do this, do this, do this, do this. That's giving a kid a whole bunch of instructions, and it's probably not going to do it. But what if we switch that around and said, here's a description of what a clean room looks like. The floor is clean, the surfaces are clear, clothes are hung in the closet, the bed is made. That's a description of the standard that we need to meet. And once you've put that standard together, and you see you're not telling people to make the bed, you're telling them that a made bed is part of a clean room. It's a whole different approach. And then once you've put your standard together, you can go to different parts of the organization, shop it around, especially in the consultation, and say, is there any reason you can't meet this standard? And you will get information from them as to whether or not they understand the standard, whether they think it's too onerous or not onerous enough. I believe that subject matter experts' best skill is in putting together these standards, describing what good looks like. So you've got all these rules that say you need to dispose of your old information. No, tell me what the inventory of a goods record management collection looks like if someone is disposing of the information they're supposed to dispose of. Give me that description. Give me that target. What does the inventory look like? People, you say, I heard for years when people had C drives, you have to clean your drive, clean it, get rid of this, get rid of that. No, I don't want that. Give me a description of what a clean drive looks like. Describe it so that we can look at it and say, all right, I want to meet that. And if you can't meet it right now, you could say, let's meet it in a year. Let's meet it in 6 months. Maybe this group can meet it and this group can't meet it. But when you put all that back in the policy, you must do this, you got to make the bed, you got to clean this, etc. Then our only choice is following the policy or breaching the policy. Donna, I'm going to put you make an interesting point. I would suggest that much of, I don't know what's in your particular scanning manual, but a lot of what's in a manual, if you can extract the actual decisions that need to be made up top and put in some delegation statement, the way Ken referred to, then you should be able to bring down the real technical stuff to a lower level. And together that makes up your manual. So it's one full document, a piece of the policy. I caution, I think there's a real, and Ken alluded to it, a real big problem with management having to approve everything that's a rule. So part of it, from my perspective, I think people go at it wrong. They say, I need to have a document, I need a records management document. What do I put in here? That's not the right question. The question is, what information do you need people to know? Where do we put that information? Where's the appropriate place to put it? Would you like people to meet certain scanning standards? Well, the appropriate place for standards is in a standard. Okay. Is there a coordinate policy rule that goes along with that standard, which gives it value and enforcement? Maybe you want people to know that you have a classification system. Where does the information go? Well, again, the classification system is a standard, but the rules around when to use it may belong in the policy. Okay, so question is not what do I throw in, but where do I put the information I want people to know? And I'll close it there, Ken. This give people lots of time for questions.
Thanks, Lewis. Yeah, that was great. Rick, do you want to bring up any? I'll monitor the chat in the QA. If anything comes up there, I can read those out. But do you want to start, Rick, with kind of follow up to Rick or Ken and Lewis?
Yeah, it's hard to follow up when you got Ken and Lewis on the session, because they've done so much of this work over the years. I feel like a young kid when it comes to the kind of knowledge that these guys have on the topic. It was interesting though, Ken, because I mean I like the same thing that you do. I like that kind of B3B kind of idea the best myself personally. It's a little simpler to kind of put together, and Lewis really great comments about putting together what that should look like, what a clean room should look like, as opposed to doing it the other way. Great stuff. We've got a few questions here. Sorry, Ken, go ahead.
So it's been really interesting to see how I've arrived at this place through slogging through the mud and going, well, this isn't working. This is working. It took me 14 years, and Lewis stands up and goes, well, this doesn't make sense. Let's do it this way. And it's like, oh, that would have been a great starting point. But a couple things. I just wanted to apologize. I was getting over bronchitis during my recording, so I was like, but that's okay. I did notice one thing that I said. I said that in the foundational policy that I included relevant or related documentation. That was just links to related documentation. It wasn't including copies of acts and things like that. So I wanted to clarify that.
Great, Ken.
I really like your comment, Lewis, about not including things that are not decided by the board. And I can give a very good example of that. A lot of the freedom of information bylaws or policies that I see wind up listing actual articles from the acts, saying this is an exception and this is an exception, rather than just saying we're using the exceptions from the act. And then the act changes, because it just in BC, it just changed. And now all of a sudden your bylaw or your policy is out of date immediately. It's not a good approach. And then maybe I'll take a shot at a couple of these questions.
Yeah, here, do you want me to maybe just go through a couple here? Donna says, do the standards get approved below the policy level, but above the manual level? So the actual standards, kind of how does that fall in where that gets approved?
I would say yes, but I throw it at Ken.
Generally, I have a standard either embedded within the policy. If we're doing policies, it's embedded in the policy or attached to the policy. So for example, I have a standard about if you're storing physical records in a location, what are the minimum conditions that you can store these physical records in so that they don't decay and get damaged. So that I include as an attachment or an appendix. If we're doing it in manual, then we'll put it in as an appendix, as a specific standard within it. And the approval is the same as approving either the RIM manual or a regular corporate level policy.
Okay, I'll go through a couple. We got quite a few here, so I'll kind of blast through a couple. So do you throw out your existing policies or how to begin an incremental change? So if you have a policy and there's changes to be made, how do you approach that?
I'm actually doing that right now for a client. They have policies from the 1990s and from the early 2000s that you look at them and it's like cell phone usage. Well, it's out of date, gone. So you repeal them, or you can have. It depends on the organization. Some organizations want things to be nice and neat, so they say this at the beginning of a new policy. They say this repeals this policy and this policy, or supersedes this policy and this policy. So that's a way of getting rid of that old chaff that no longer doesn't make any sense. And I do that incrementally. Of course, typically I get hired to come in and do a policy project. So I look at all the old policies that have any kind of information management in them and say, this one's still relevant. This one, we need to take this paragraph out completely. It's a bit of a jigsaw in order to go through and make sure that everything's brought up to speed. But you have to go in with a critical eye as to what the policy does, whether it's written well. There's a couple that I have to just throw out because they're just a mess. It's like somebody having a conversation with a dog and sorry, getting off track. I'm going to start a rant.
Just to follow up on that too, often what happens when you're addressing policies that are being repealed, you never want to leave gaps, right? Like if the project is to develop policies to make sure not repealing something that's going to leave a gap in your organizational policies.
Yeah, I always, and I have done policy work, of course, but I always have to go read them all together. So I first go out and try and find all the policies in the organization that relate to what I'm doing. And then I try to read them all together because certainly they weren't all written at the same time. They were written in all kinds of different time frames. And some of them totally are wrong compared to the other policies that you're reading. So you have to go through and kind of read them all in some kind of rational period of time. And you can see the glaring holes, and this one shouldn't be there because it conflicts with this one over here. And they were just written at different times, like spaghetti policy kind of situation. Did you find that?
I'll go on to the next one here. So just to kind of be a little more clear to what are the differences between standards, guidelines, and procedures in your guys' eyes?
Do you mind if I take a crack at that, Ken?
I'll take a crack at it and then you can correct me.
Okay.
I definitely see standards as kind of like a goal, much like what Lewis was talking about. It's like you want to head for this. This is the standard. And that's not just these kind of international standards and Canadian standards, but standards that you create for your own organization. As for the guidelines and the procedures, it's so, there are things that may not have a end standard. For example, a response to a legal hold. You kind of have to write down the steps saying how are we going to approach this, so that you do it consistently, so that you do it legally. That's kind of and the guideline is a procedure. Well, actually, I guess it kind of straddles policy and procedure. Yeah, please correct me, Lewis.
No, I would say overall that you're right. I think that the way you described your specification earlier about the requirements that you have to meet, that's what a standard is. It's a set of technical specifications. A procedure is very easy. It has a beginning and an end, and steps go in order. Okay, if the steps don't have to be done in order, like you're running through a checklist and you can do it any particular order, that's not a procedure, right? Procedure has an order. So, and then everything else I put under the guidelines. That's I'm very close to you.
That makes sense.
The reason to separate standards and procedures is more than just logistical and navigational to be able to find them. our role, I believe, as IM people is to be able to present the goal, the standard, and to make a defensible argument for why that's the standard and what the risks of not reaching the standard are. But the actual piece that says, okay, everybody, you're going to follow that standard, that's not my role as the specialist. That's the role of the boss. That's their responsibility to say, it's more important to chase the listeria outbreak than it is to follow your IM standards, or it's more important to follow your IM standards because I don't want to get caught in the newspaper. That's the job of the boss. And our job is to present him with those arguments, defensible arguments on why we chose it and what the risk of not doing it is. Does that work for you?
So that's interesting because in my policies, I always try to have a pretty robust purpose. Why are we doing this policy? I kind of see, as this discussion is going on, that's kind of fitting this standard role. Like, we want to have our information protected. We want to have it non-corruptible, and we want to make sure that information is available and things like this. So this is kind of setting up a standard in the purpose statement. So I'm
okay. So I would have called that like an objective.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Whereas I think of standards as being very specific, a standard for scanned information, for digitization of information, a standard for a safe repository. The example that you gave us was in your
Storage of physical records.
Right, a standard for storage of physical records. That's absolutely the target.
Okay.
The reason, if somebody comes and says, I don't want to use that thing, and I don't know why you chose it, the answer on why you chose it is your answer as a technical specialist. But the fact that you need to use it because it creates risk for the business, I can explain, but that's not really my role to impose on you, right? That is the role of senior management. Carolyn, I would have said that the standards are what's the target? And policy are more high-level statements. Justification, intent, principles, overall goals, objectives. I would have put that into policy. But the standard, I don't know if it's how well, it's what does good look like? What's the target? What do we want to see?
No, that's good. One of the things, even at kind of all these different levels, I'm hearing is the idea of the defensible, like, you got to be able to explain why, and explaining the why sometimes helps people understand, and you get more buy-in when people actually know why. We're not just parents saying, do what I say, and what I do kind of stuff, right? Okay, let's hop to the next one here. In a 3-line defense model, which line do you see owning policies? So we talked about kind of the board level and how that's where all that stuff gets approved. But in a 3-line defense, I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that, but who do you see owning the policy?
I don't know what 3 lines of defense model is.
Okay, was Dennis, maybe you want to elaborate on that? Just to the last part of it, then, who do you see owning a policy? Like, is that something that's always at the board level? I guess it depends on the organization too, right?
So this is where I really think it starts at the highest level and then comes down. And like I said, even departments could create a policy specific to their department. So there's like multiple levels at which it could be, but we need to identify what level that policy is connected with.
Just as you're kind of mentioning that, a crazy notion that I had, these saying policy being kind of developed at any of those level. Are there any circumstances where an individual policy, I've got a policy for myself, where you feel like that would be, why not? Yeah,
sure. You might not want to publish it in a RIM manual, but
true. Got my own manuals. Okay, another question here. This one says for Ken. What kind of policies do you include in the basic 5 policies mentioned in your recording there? I
kind of thought this might come up. I do a foundational one that explains everything. Then I do an accountability one, because roles and responsibilities associated with positions across the organization is very important, so that you can when you're doing training and you go to the information workers, you can say, these are the 3 things you're responsible for. And when you go to the board and talk to them about records management, you can say, these are the 4 things that you are responsible for, that kind of thing. Obviously, the vast majority of the tasks and roles and responsibilities are either with the RIM manager or the RIM staff, whether they're departmental RIM staff or corporate RIM staff. The third one is all the RIM stuff. So destroying records, storing records, transferring records, all the kind of functions of records management. And then the fourth one that I usually always do is information security. In this day and age, if you don't have an information security policy, you're potentially setting yourself up to fail. And of course, this needs to be hand in hand with your IT department. So you need to be able to talk to them and say, are we doing multi-factor authentication? Are we doing encrypting of laptops that go out of the building? Are we making sure there's no data on laptops that go out of the building? Things like this. And then the fifth one that I do is legal hold. And I've had pushback at times on legal hold policy. People saying, well, we don't need that as one of our basic ones. And it's like, well, risk is a risk management policy, number one. So if you think you're never going to get sued, well, then good for you, and then we don't need to do it. But the risk is the impact of it can be quite high if you don't have a legal hold policy. And quite frankly, it's a pretty simple one. It's not rocket science. It just says, we're going to protect our records in case there's a lawsuit. Here's what we keep our eyes open for. And this is the procedure for applying, changing, eliminating a legal hold. It's really a pretty small, simple policy. So I figure for the effort, it's pretty small. The reward, it's pretty big. So let's just do it, and then it's done.
I want to offer another suggestion, if I can, about a shortcut to getting policies done. When I was at industry, the IM department was really interested in getting this policy out for IM, and because they wanted people to learn they had to value and maintain and protect and use and dispose information assets. Well, there was already a policy coming out of the department that applied to corporate assets, vehicles, finance, that said that everybody will value, maintain, protect, and use and dispose of the corporate assets. And all they had to do was go and ask that group to amend the sentence to include information assets. And the reason they didn't do it is because why should those people make rules about our subject? Like it was protective, it was siloed. But that's not right. I mean, we want to be working together with other departments. And if you can leverage something off the IT for your information security, I think Ken will agree 100%. You don't need your own if you can just add your stuff to their policy.
Right. Actually, this kind of leads into the next question, if you want to follow up on that. And Donna says here, I'm noticing that data governance folks are going off on their own and creating a number of policies. What are some of the best practices related to data governance that you're observing? Do you want to give a shot at that, Lisa?
Yeah, I'm going to let Ken.
Data governance has not strongly impinged on my life at this time. They are trying to keep it close to the chest so that records managers don't get involved. And it's getting to be, we're going to have a head-to-head at some point, because I'm getting wind of the fact that they are starting now to create policy, and some of those policies will be in conflict with good records and information management practices. So if you can move towards an information governance model, you can drag them in the room, assuming you have authority. If you can drag them into the room, you might be able to create some very good policies that includes data. But right now they are trying to exist on their own.
Does everybody, Ken, let me just ask the question, in your experience so far, does everybody know the difference between data and information?
Not at all. Absolutely not.
And
So
nor
there
do they
lies
agree.
one of the issues.
Nor do they agree on what the difference is.
No.
Yep.
Even,
And I would concur that I have seen across the country data scientists showing up in organizations all of a sudden, larger organizations obviously, but people coming out of academia as data scientist classifications, and they're being hired to deal with that issue. And I would say that you're absolutely right, that sooner or later there's going to be some conflict between records and information management and some of
we
those
have to get together.
policies. Yep.
Yeah. In the Canada School of Public Service, there is a data community that they have, data management community they're building up, and they define data as information used as the basis for a decision. That's how data is defined. And as far as they're concerned, like nothing to do with structured or unstructured or any of the things that we've been thinking of. So I think we're way far apart. And Donna, you do raise a good point that we have some work to do to bridge that gap.
If you can sell the concept of information governance,
Yeah.
you might be able to draw them in.
Mhm.
All right, the next question here, I think, is going to apply to a lot of people here because a lot of the RIM folks are often doing it off their side of the desk. So here's, let me read the question. As a small organization where I'm handed responsibility for RIM and privacy, what is a recommended approach for getting senior management to assign clear and visible responsibilities? So often in smaller organizations, the team is usually, 2 hours a week, I roll over here and do records management. So how can you get some senior management to buy in?
This actually, I think this is the Achilles heel of records management programs. The fact that we don't have a real good way to report what we are doing to senior executive, we have really kind of failed on this, and I've kicked around the idea for years of trying to come up with some sort of reporting structure, because if you remember that ladder, compliance reporting needs to go back up that ladder to the board or to senior executive. But right now we really don't have that in a good manner. So if we could really put together annual reports saying, this is where our risks are, this is my objectives, we're failing on this, we're doing well on that. You need to be able to communicate that to senior management.
Okay, next question here. Have you come across some policy style guides that can be shared as a resource? I've been using Lewis's book as a reference to some other things that you located some other, sorry, have you located some other ones that can be used? So any other resources in terms of policy style guides?
I'll just say that whenever I talk to a client, because I'm independent, I say, please give me a template, and I follow their template.
So say we're starting from scratch. Is there kind of somewhere where you would start?
Yeah, then I would just use a template that I like.
Yeah.
My favorite one.
It comes up often, and part of this kind of community that we're doing here is to have other people in similar situations too. So for example, there's a lot of municipality here, talking to other municipalities that might actually be further along with you, especially in the RIM community at records management. That kind of collaboration is usually very easily found as well. So okay, go on to the next one. Says Donna said ARMA put out some documents as well for physical storage. Sorry, that was in reference. Trying to get caught up here. Here we go. Ken, have you seen policies that promotes the RM principles at the highest level?
That's actually, I include the RM principles in those foundational ones that I was talking about. So right at the beginning, I say, this is based on the records management principles or IG principles, and I list them out. In some places, I even on each policy that I develop, I say, this covers off the principles of transparency, of accountability, so that sort of thing, just kind of highlight it. It's not necessary. It's probably something I should remove. Yeah, I always have that at my foundational level.
For So there's some questions here too about Dennis. Dennis has posted a bunch of information here that maybe if you're willing to share, Dennis, we can maybe make that available for everybody. He's got a couple of internal definitions and stuff that he's given to everybody that maybe we can have posted. The enterprise framework, for example. Yeah.
Do you mean Denise?
Denise, sorry, did I say Dennis?
Denise.
Denise, sorry, I said Dennis. Okay. So I kind of, there was quite a few posts here, and I got to the end of a bunch of questions, and there's a bunch of discussion here that I'm trying to get over. Have you seen any other questions here that you'd like to address while I catch up?
I will say, Donna, about the scanning stuff. We can talk offline if you want. I have done a scanning manual for a municipality. So maybe send me an email and we can set up a time to chat, but it'll have to be sometime like next week or something.
And then Peggy, kind of at the end here, says something similar to what I said, is the templates and that other organizations in similar industries is a good place to start looking in groups like this, or ARMA, local ARMA chapters and things.
Earlier, Donna had mentioned that it would be helpful, if ARMA had collections of some of the stuff, standards especially. I could see if people had standards for things like the storage of paper records. That is something that ARMA could very well share and could easily be adopted by an organization without changing the governance structure of your own policy suite. You just pull that in and make the changes. It would be really nice if they had that kind of stuff.
Maybe I just wouldn't mind making a comment on like what you said earlier, Ken, about you mentioned the principles, and of course we all know the principles fairly well, but you had then restated that as IG principles. I just wanted to kind of go through a little bit of historical reference for those that are actually using the principles. They will see that ARMA International has those listed as IG principles now. What happened was ARMA headquarters renamed the principles to the IG principles without actually changing them. So they really aren't information governance principles. They're really RIM principles still, even though it says IG principles on the head of the page. So just so everybody knows, they shouldn't go out thinking those are information governance principles specifically. They're RIM principles.
I think we have a bigger problem when it comes to the conflict of those principles with business principles. And a good example I think of is compliance. We've been walking around saying you need to comply. That is not a business principle, compliance. Business is not founded on its compliance. There is a business principle behind there, which is accountability. Saying, I did it, I'm accountable, I did it, and I did it by the book, and I'm honest, and I'm candid, and I didn't cheat, and I didn't cut corners. That's a business style principle. And if they want to reach that accountability properly, they're going to need to comply. But compliance in itself we've got all these IG values which support, or RIM values that support our work, but we're going to need to make that connection directly to the business values. Because it's very easy for somebody to say, I don't understand what retention and disposition has to do with my selling skis. It's a fair question.
Yeah. I think that ties back in with what Ken said earlier about the kind of failures, a pretty ugly word, but the way we've kind of failed at moving our reporting of what we've been doing as records and information management professionals back up the ladder to the senior management folks, so that we can get them on side it's all a big circle coming back. We do need to have some link with senior management so they can say, yes, you're doing a great job, or we need to do more things, or we need more budget for you to get those things done, because right now we don't have that necessarily from the top down.
One of the other things I've seen a lot too, coming back to the procedures, coming up to follow policies, and that is often when you're trying to get people to buy in, the explanation is one thing, but I'm also a big fan of the procedures, for lack of a better word, tricking people into following the policies. So you're not going to explain records retention and disposition to somebody that's not a records person, but if we can have the procedures in place that allow them to follow those RIM policies without even understanding them is always I've always been a big proponent of that. So I think that's kind of wrapped up most of the questions and stuff here.
Oh, do we have time? Donna put an interesting question in there. Do you see value in building performance measures and compliance monitoring into policy development? And I wanted to ask Lewis what he thought about that one.
Absolutely. I absolutely see there's value there. My only caution is that our job when it comes to that is reporting, monitoring, measuring, reporting, and sending it up. We're not the police. I don't believe that our role is to be the police.
Right.
Our role is to report and explain the risk of what it is that we found.
So would you recommend having a proposed standard as to performance measures?
Sure. Depending on the subject. I mean, I couldn't tell which areas in RM would benefit most from those. I think you'd probably be in a better position to do that.
It's actually something that we've struggled with for a long time, because it would be like, how do you measure records management? It's a bit, the measurements that we can do are almost kind of kindergarten-ish. Like, yes, we destroyed 1,800 file folders. Okay.
Yeah, but I agree. That's
every time somebody asks me for KPIs, I start to shake.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. And I don't think it's a fair question, because it'd be like saying, we spent $400,000 on new carpeting. Show me the ROI on that carpeting.
Yeah.
So I think it is to a certain degree unfair investment. However, if we have a standard and we're not meeting the standard, that we can report on as an operational.
I like that a lot, Lewis. I like that a lot.
What percent of our installation does not meet the standard that we said we need people to meet? That's a fair KPI.
So in other words, we get management to agree on what we say the standard should look like. Here's what we think is good, and you agree with us, this is good. So we're going to report back to you on how well we're doing on this, because you've agreed that that's important.
And management will decide what's acceptable. So in computers, it might be that 95% downtime is acceptable, or 99% downtime, or for some systems, 20% downtime.
Mm-hmm.
But for each of these different standards we put forward, you're going to have to make an argument what percent of the time is acceptable that we don't meet this standard. And there may be some of them where you say, there's no, we have to meet it 99% of the time.
Yeah.
But you have that flexibility if you've done it as a standard.
Yeah, all these years, I mean, things as simple things like how many hours a day an employee tries to find things that's always been one of those key performance indicators everybody's tried to use. Like, we're going to save people time because they'll find things easier in the EDRMS system or whatever, right? How do you actually prove that? I mean, how do you actually define that? How much time we saved people from finding things in a system? That kind of stuff is, you can't really put a number to it. You could pull something out of the air, but it's not really something you can defend later.
So I know we're at the end of our time, which Brian has made a great comment. I want to, can I get 20 seconds here to comment on it?
Yeah.
So it talked about the fact that your policies said that you were fired. We are not the police. There is an HR disciplinary process in place, and they have a system of what's a Class A felony, Class B felony, that's a misdemeanor. What we need to do is hook into that register to be able to say, we would like to take this infraction and add it to your list of what constitutes major infractions of company policies. Because we should be leveraging their disciplinary process instead of trying to create one of our own.
Yep, that's a good point. And there definitely seems to be lots of people interested in maybe just doing a full session on auditing, reporting, and some of this other stuff we're talking about on how do we enforce and what do we do with getting value out of putting these policies in place. So definitely something we'll look at as a follow-up. Yeah.
Thank you, Donna. But I can't come back without Ken, because he's the one who grounds me on the record side.
We have to get approval from both of you to come back and for the next session.
Yeah,
I can only talk in generalities. You need somebody with the subject matter expertise like Ken to be able to make that connection to what does it mean for your office. So happy to come back, Rick, but not without a Ken on the side there to fill in those gaps.
Ken, how about you?
I'm trying to think of somebody who's really done records management reporting. And I know one person who did it in the late 90s for about 4 years for the Ministry of Forests, and that's it. I always was going to try and get a focus group together to try and say, what do we need to report on? How are we going to report on it? What things?
Maybe we need to put a panel together that can be that focus group in a session to talk about a bunch of those topics related to reporting back up to senior management.
Yeah. Auditing, on the other hand, is a completely different thing.
Right.
Auditing is, again, a completely separate discussion. Yeah. And very interesting as well.
Well, that's great. We're definitely at the top of the hour here, and I know people have to skate off. I want to thank Ken and Lewis so much for being on the session, and you as well, Troy, for being here today. Thanks to all of you for supporting Learn With Us, and of course the IM Canada Connect as well. There is a session next week on IM Canada Connect that's the Saskatchewan chapter is going to be doing. I'll actually be on that panel, so don't leave because of that. Come to the session, and we'll try and put together a new session related to what we just talked about. Thank you so much, and everybody have a really great rest of your week.